Please place your hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph R. Biden, Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph R. Biden, Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The Vice President of the United States of America is the second highest public office in the federal government. Many of the men who have held this office have risen to the office of the President. Others continue to serve their country through representation in Congress or philanthropic public works, and still others have faded into obscurity. The methods for selecting the Vice President, and indeed the office itself, have undergone many changes in the United States' 200 years of existence, which is easy to understand in a position which, like the President, was created in a time before the prevalence of political parties. While the position is sometimes ignored or maligned, even by those who have held the office, the Vice President is an important figure in American politics and government. The Vice President's duties to his country, his constituents, and his President are varied and many. Join us as we take a look at the Vice President from politics to power.
The second office of this government is honorable and easy. The first is but a splendid misery.
If, like Thomas Jefferson said, the Vice Presidency was easy, he differed in opinion with the United States' first Vice President, John Adams. Adams famously said of the office,
"My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. And as I can do neither good nor evil, I must be borne away by others and meet the common fate."
Largely ignored by President George Washington, who rarely consulted Adams on policy or other matters, Adams took his other constitutional duty as President of the Senate very seriously. The main crux of a vice president's responsibilities in the Senate is to cast tie-breaking votes in the event that legislation deadlocks. Adams, during his 2 terms as vice president, cast a record 29 tie-breaking votes, a number that has still never been beaten. Only later, Vice President John C. Calhoun would come close, with 28 tie-breaking votes. As president of the Senate, Adams also actively persuaded senators to vote against legislation he opposed. And more than once, Adams gave stern lectures to the governing body about procedural and policy matters. Adams was forced to restrain himself, however, by the start of his second term as vice president. Adams' zeal had attracted the attentions of critics of Washington's administration, making him a target. Washington's opponents threatened resolutions that would reduce the vice president's powers even further, silencing the office except in matters of procedure and policy. Afterwards, Adams remained much quieter than he had been in Senate affairs, which surely must have aggravated the brilliant but vain statesman. Adams would regain his political power and more when elected president in his own right in 1796. Still, the experience clearly left Adams bitter about the process of democracy, as he wrote in his unpublished Letters to John Taylor in 1814.
Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. It is in vain to say that democracy is less vain, less proud, less selfish, less ambitious, or less avaricious than aristocracy or monarchy. It is not true, in fact, and nowhere appears in history. Those passions are the same in all men, under all forms of simple government, and when unchecked, produce the same effects of fraud, violence, and cruelty.
Though Washington and Adams were the first president and vice president to not see eye to eye, they certainly would not be the last. Under the initial terms of the Constitution, the Electoral College was responsible only for voting for president, rather than both the president and vice president as running mates. Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution made clear the process by which the president was to be chosen.
The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they shall make a list of all the persons voted for and of the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all of the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. And if there be more than one who have such majority, and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for President. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the President. But in choosing the President, the vote shall be taken by states, the representatives from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary to a choice. In every case, after the choice of the President, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the Vice President. But if there should remain 2 or more who have equal votes, the Senate shall choose from them by ballot the Vice President.
This plan, however, failed to foresee the formation of political parties and even personal and political differences of opinion between the 2 candidates, such as the case between Washington and Adams. When Adams was elected president, the president-elect had been a staunch Federalist, while his runner-up, and now vice president, Thomas Jefferson, had aligned himself with the Democratic Republicans. As it happened, the 2 men were often at odds about foreign policy and other issues, such as states' rights. In the election of 1800, the 2 parties actually ran candidates for vice president, but the electoral process at that time had no way of differentiating which candidate they wanted for president and which for vice president. As it turned out, the candidates Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr wound up with a tie. It took the House of Representatives 36 ballots to elect the winner, with Thomas Jefferson emerging as president and Burr as his vice president. 4 years later, this incident was rectified with the 12th Amendment, which instructed electors to use separate ballots for president and vice president. Some argue that this diminished the prestige of the office, contending that the vice president was no longer a challenging presidential candidate. Under the amendment, if no vice presidential candidate received a majority, then the matter fell to the Senate. In theory, this could have led to a situation where the incumbent vice president, in his role as president of the Senate, would be required to cast his tie-breaking vote, either re-electing himself or his successor. While this particular situation has never arisen, the Senate has voted for the vice president exactly once. When Martin Van Buren's running mate, Richard Mentor Johnson, was accused of having lived with a black woman, the 23 electors from the state of Virginia refused to vote for him, although they still voted for Van Buren. The Senate then elected Johnson in a 33-17 vote.
Once the election is over, the vice president's usefulness is over. He's like the second stage of a rocket. He's damn important going into orbit, but he's always thrown off to burn up in the atmosphere.
While the 12th Amendment is technically still law, stating the vice president and president are to be elected separately, currently, this is no longer the practice. Presidents and vice presidents are actually elected as running mates, and a presidential candidate's selection of vice president can become just as important as any of their platforms. Inauguration Day, March 4, 1841, saw Vice President John Tyler serve as president of the Senate for all of 2 hours, when he swore in the new senators, then received and confirmed President Harrison's cabinet appointments. Some historians posit that John Tyler would have been as obscure as any 19th century vice president if William Henry Harrison had lived to serve out his term. As it turned out, however, exactly a month after Harrison was sworn in as president and Tyler as vice president, Harrison succumbed to failing health and died on April 4, 1841. 2 days later, at 4 a.m. the morning of April 6th, Tyler returned to Washington and took the oath of office and was sworn in as the 10th President of the United States. Some in Congress, particularly Tyler's opposition, questioned whether Tyler was to assume the office of president full-on or if he was to merely be acting president. Those who argued for the acting president label thought the original text of the Constitution did not make clear whether the actual title of president fell upon the vice president, or if merely the duties and responsibilities fell upon him as well. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution only stated,
In case of the removal of the President from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President.
For Tyler, there was never any doubt. He was now president, unequivocally. He ignored his critics, who came to refer to Tyler as his accidency, and he returned mail and correspondence unopened, which had been sent to the White House that was addressed to the vice president or acting president. Harrison's cabinet, which Tyler had decided to retain, expected the new president to continue exactly as Harrison had. When they informed Tyler of his predecessor's practice of using majority vote to establish policy, Tyler replied,
I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I am very glad to have in my cabinet such able statesmen as you have proved yourselves to be, and I shall be pleased to avail myself of your counsel and advice. But I can never consent to being dictated to as to what I shall or shall not do. I, as president, shall be responsible for my administration. I hope to have your hearty cooperation in carrying out its measures. So long as you see fit to do this, I shall be glad to have you with me. When you think otherwise, your resignations will be accepted.
Tyler's take-charge attitude was hard to ignore. His decisive actions led to resolutions passed by Congress officially naming Tyler the 10th President of the United States. The incident set a precedent that wasn't clarified in the Constitution until the 25th Amendment, adopted nearly 120 years later on February 23, 1967.
If the tide of defamation and abuse shall turn, and my administration come to be praised, future vice presidents who may succeed to the presidency may feel some slight encouragement to pursue an independent course.
10th Vice President John Calhoun achieved distinction, but not as a vice president. Though he is famous for a number of firsts in that office, he later achieved more notoriety and influence as a United States Senator. He was the first vice president to resign, and before that became only the second and one of only 2 vice presidents to serve under 2 different presidents.
If it be conceded, as it must be by everyone who is the least conversant with our institutions, that the sovereign powers delegated are divided between the general and the state governments, that the latter should hold their portion by the same tenure as the former, it would seem impossible to deny to the states the right of deciding on the infractions of their powers and the proper remedy to be applied for their correction. The right of judging in such cases is an essential attribute of sovereignty, of which the states cannot be divested without losing their sovereignty itself, and being reduced to a subordinate corporate condition. In fact, to divide power and to give to one of the parties the exclusive right of judging of the portion allotted to each is, in reality, not to divide at all. And to reserve such exclusive right to the general government, it matters not by what department to be exercised, is to convert it, in fact, into a great consolidated government with unlimited powers, and to divest the states, in reality, of all their rights. It is impossible to understand the force of terms and to deny so plain a conclusion.
Initially supportive of certain tariffs as a way of generating governmental revenue, Vice President John C. Calhoun, who had served in that office under John Quincy Adams and by 1832 was serving under Andrew Jackson, led a debate over states' ability to declare federal law unconstitutional. The nullification crisis of 1832 arose when South Carolina issued an ordinance that essentially nullified federal tariffs. Calhoun's home state, in his view, had every right to pass this ordinance. The issue caused a rift between Calhoun and President Andrew Jackson, as well as others in Congress. Those who supported the nullification said that the tariffs only stood to benefit northern manufacturers and not southern farmers, who had already been hit hard by an economic downturn. In December of 1832, Calhoun resigned from the office of vice president, deciding that more political power was to be wielded in the Senate. And indeed, he soon held more influence in that position.
The very essence of a free government consists in considering offices as public trusts, bestowed of the good of the country, and not for the benefit of an individual or a party. The government of the absolute majority instead of the government of the people is but the government of the strongest interests. And when not efficiently checked, it is the most tyrannical and oppressive that can be devised.
The nullification crisis was one of several key events that many historians argue led the United States into the Civil War. Calhoun was an anti-abolitionist who supported slavery as an integral part of agricultural industry in the South. Calhoun inspired many Southern secessionists with his strong rhetorical defense of the institution of slavery, running counter to abolitionist sentiments coming from the North.
I consider the Tariff Act as the occasion, rather than the real cause, of the present unhappy state of things. The truth can no longer be disguised that the peculiar domestic institution of the Southern states and the consequent direction which that and her soil have given to her industry has placed them in regard to taxation and appropriations in opposite relation to the majority of the Union, against the danger of which, if there be no protective power in the reserved rights of the states, they must in the end be forced to rebel or submit to have their paramount interests sacrificed, the domestic institutions subordinated by colonization and other schemes, and to themselves and children reduced to wretchedness.
Though Calhoun died over 10 years before the start of the Civil War, the cast iron man directly influenced the secessionists of 1860 and 1861, and his ideological rigidity and determination to defend the causes he believed in led him to be named in 1957 by a Senate committee as one of the 5 greatest U.S. senators, along with Robert La Follette, Robert Taft, and the other 2 members of what historians have named the Great Triumvirate of Congressional Leaders, Henry Clay, who represented Western expansion, and Daniel Webster, representing the ideals of the North. The ideals of the Southern slaveholder, the settlers of the frontier, and the Northern business owners were all at odds on the issue of slavery and its abolition or expansion.
And now, Mr. President, instead of speaking of the possibility or utility of secession, instead of dwelling in these caverns of darkness, instead of groping with those ideas so full of all that is horrid and horrible, let us come out into the light of day. Let us enjoy the fresh airs of liberty and union. Let us cherish those hopes which belong to us. Let us devote ourselves to those great objects that are fit for our consideration and our action. Let us raise our conceptions to the magnitude and the importance of the duties that devolve upon us. Let our comprehension be as broad as the country for which we act, our aspirations as high as its certain destiny. Let us not be pygmies in a case that calls for men. Never did there devolve on any generation of men higher trusts than now devolve upon us for the preservation of this Constitution and the harmony and peace of all who are destined to live under it. Let us make our generation one of the strongest and the brightest links in that golden chain which is destined, I fondly believe, to grapple the people of all the states to this Constitution for ages to come.
A member of the aforementioned Great Triumvirate, Daniel Webster was a beloved statesman and senator from Massachusetts in the period leading up to the American Civil War. Remembered as an eloquent speaker and one of the nation's most prominent conservatives, Webster served in the House of Representatives for 10 years, the Senate for 19 years, and was named Secretary of State under 3 different presidents: Millard Fillmore, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler. Many viewed Webster as a mouthpiece for the interests of bankers and industrialists, failing to represent any concerns of the common people, particularly those in the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson. He fought staunchly against secession and the Civil War, once stating,
"When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. Let their last, feeble, and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, not a stripe erased or polluted, nor a single star obscure, bearing for its motto no such miserable interrogatory as, 'What is all this worth?' nor those other words of delusion and folly, 'Liberty first and union afterwards,' but everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds, as they float over the sea and over the land, and in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment, dear to every true American heart: liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable."
Webster unsuccessfully ran for president 3 times, failing to gain the nomination in 1836 and 1848, and coming in a distant third in the election of 1852. In both 1839 and 1848, the Whig Party offered Webster the vice presidency, which he declined, stating, "I do not propose to be buried until I am really dead and in my coffin." Ironically, both of the presidents offering the office died while serving as president. The death of William Henry Harrison and later Zachary Taylor would have seen Webster ascend to the office of the president. It could be argued that the low opinion he held for the office of vice president destroyed his own shot at the presidency itself. Whatever his goals as president would have been, Webster continued in politics with a career that spanned over 40 years. In 1957, Webster, too, was named one of the 5 greatest U.S. senators of all time by a Senate committee.
Men may die, but the fabric of our free institutions remains unshaken.
For a total of 16 times throughout United States history, the office of the vice president has been vacant. This has been mostly through death, but 2 vice presidents have resigned, such as John C. Calhoun. Calhoun felt confined and marginalized in the office and left to pursue a far more influential career as a senator.
I could not think in the present state of parties of entering again in the political arena. I would but waste my strength and exhaust my time without adding to my character or rendering service to the country or advancing the cause for which I have so long contended. I feel no disgust, nor do I feel disposed to complain of anyone. On the contrary, I am content and willing to end my public life now. In looking back, I see nothing to regret and little to correct. My interest in the prosperity of our country and the success of our peculiar and sublime political system, when well understood, remain without abatement, and will do so till my last breath. And I shall ever stand prepared to serve the country whenever I shall see reasonable prospect of doing so.
George Clinton and Elbridge Gerry, 4th and 5th vice presidents, as well as Henry Wilson, Thomas Hendricks, Garrett Hobart, James Sherman, and William R. King have all died in office. William R. King, who served as vice president under Franklin Pierce, also has the distinction of serving the shortest term as vice president, with only 45 days in office before succumbing to tuberculosis on April 18, 1853. While his career in that office was short, King remains the only vice president to hail from Alabama and held the highest political office of anyone from that state so far.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
25th Amendment. Section 1. In case of the removal of the President from office or of his death or resignation, the Vice President shall become President.
On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, resulting in Vice President Lyndon Johnson being sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Following the precedent set by John Tyler after the death of William Henry Harrison in 1841, the assassination of JFK and the ascension of Johnson cemented the need to clarify the ambiguous and at that time still debated wording of Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the United States Constitution. 4 years later, the 25th Amendment was passed and ratified, and it would prove to be instrumental in the coming administrations.
I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. And I hope that such prayers will also be the first of many. If you have not chosen me by secret ballot, neither have I gained office by any secret promises. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I have not subscribed to any partisan platform. I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife. As I begin this very difficult job, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
25th Amendment. Section 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the Vice President, the President shall nominate a Vice President who shall take office upon confirmation of a majority vote of both houses of Congress.
In 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from the office of President rather than face impeachment proceedings, which he would surely lose. After the resignation of Spiro Agnew the previous year, Nixon chose House Minority Leader Gerald Ford as his vice president. 7 months later, Ford found himself in the Oval Office and nominated former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. The House of Representatives and the Senate later confirmed this choice.
It was entirely a question of there being a constitutional crisis and a crisis of confidence on the part of the American people. I felt there was a duty incumbent on any American who could do anything that would contribute to a restoration of confidence in the democratic process and in the integrity of government.
The 3 years in the White House for Ford and Rockefeller were historic almost solely because, for the first time in the United States, the president and vice president had not been elected by the Electoral College. It seemed symbolic then, when in 1977 the two men ran for re-election, that they lost to the Democratic Carter Mondale ticket. The people, it seemed, had finally spoken.
I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln. My addresses will never be as eloquent as Mr. Lincoln's, but I will do my very best to equal his brevity and his plain speaking. As a man of Congress, let me reaffirm my convictions that the collective wisdom of our two great legislative bodies, while not infallible, will in the end serve the people faithfully and very, very well. As I look into these faces that fill this familiar room, and as I imagine those faces in other rooms across the land, I do not see members of the legislative branch, or the executive branch, or the judicial branch, though I am very much aware of the importance of keeping the separate but co-equal branches of our federal government in balance. I do not see senators or representatives, nor do I see Republicans or Democrats, vital as the two-party system is to sustain freedom and responsible government. At this moment of visible and living unity, I see only Americans. I see Americans who love their country, Americans who work and sacrifice for their country and their children. I see Americans who pray without ceasing for peace among all nations and for harmony at home.
25th Amendment, Section 3. Whenever the President transmits to the President pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the Vice President as acting President.
It is sometimes erroneously inferred that the President pro tempore assumes the office of acting Vice President during a vacancy of the office. The President pro temp merely assumes the traditionally vice presidential duty of President of the Senate in the Vice President's absence. No tradition or law exists that would grant powers to the President pro temp as acting Vice President, and no one, so far, who could have been regarded as such has ever succeeded to the office of the presidency.
Once there were two brothers. One ran away to the sea. The other was elected Vice President of the United States, and nothing was heard of either of them again.
Just as with some United States presidents, vice presidents have come and gone that have either established themselves through distinguished diplomatic or political works, or by rising to the presidency themselves after their time as VP. However, just as many, if not more, vice presidents have come and gone without ever becoming noteworthy individuals outside the office of vice president. Some became notorious for either their obstinance in dealing with their opposing party, or even their own party or president, while others died in office or otherwise faded into obscurity. We begin our look at a few of the best and worst vice presidents, with a man that one reporter called the best vice presidential candidate in 20 years, Al Gore.
The very first words that we, the American nation, spoke were right here in Philadelphia. You know those words, we the people. It wasn't we the conglomerates. It wasn't we the corporations. It was we the people.
In 1992, presidential candidate Bill Clinton chose Al Gore to be his running mate. Many political strategists thought the choice unwise. The two men were Southern and around the same age, and traditionally, a running mate was chosen that would diversify the ticket and allow for the broadest appeal among voters. By choosing a vice president that was so close to his own age, Clinton was able to work with Gore to build a stronger administration with a more focused agenda. Gore was chosen for his stance on the environment, foreign policy experience, and his commitment as a family man. Clinton also consulted Gore as his principal advisor for nominations to key White House staff appointments. And together with Gore, the Clinton administration was able to expand the economy with record low unemployment and poverty rates. They kept peace abroad and in the United States and made strides in advances in technology and environmental awareness, including the greenhouse effect. After 2 successful terms with the Clinton White House, Gore ran for president in 2000. Although Gore won the popular vote, he lost the electoral vote, with Florida's electors being won by just 537 votes. After the 2000 election, Gore continued his environmental advocacy. In 2006, An Inconvenient Truth, a documentary that presented Al Gore's lecture and slideshow detailing the effects of global warming, was released. It went on to globally raise more awareness about the subject and became the 9th highest grossing documentary in the United States.
And I hope to stand for a new harmony, a greater tolerance. We've come far, but I think we need a new harmony among the races in our country, and we're on a journey into a new century. And we've got to leave that tired old baggage of bigotry behind.
In the 1980 election, George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan both vied for the presidential nomination that year. When Reagan won the bid, Bush was certain his political career was over. However, Reagan in turn selected Bush as his vice presidential nominee. The move not only jump-started Bush's career, but served to win votes from Republicans that had supported Bush for president in the primary elections. Initially, Bush kept a low profile as vice president, with he and his wife, Barbara, attending ceremonial events and state funerals, where Mrs. Bush said,
George met with many current or future heads of state at the funerals he attended, enabling him to forge personal relationships that were important to President Reagan.
These relationships also became important to Bush later, as he was elected president in his own right in 1989. As vice president, Bush stepped up during times of crisis, such as when Reagan was shot and seriously wounded in 1981. When aides advised Bush to proceed to the White House by helicopter, Bush declined, stating that only the president lands on the South Lawn. during Reagan's second term, Bush became the first vice president to serve as acting president for about 8 hours on July 13, 1985, when the president underwent surgery. Bush's experience in the White House and as president of the Senate served him well. In 1988, he successfully ran for president, taking office on January 20th, 1989.
We understood each other's needs, respected each other's opinions, we kept each other's confidence. Our relationship in the White House held up under the searing pressure of that place because we entered our offices understanding, perhaps for the first time in the history of those offices, that each of us could do a better job if we maintained the trust of the other. And for 4 years, that trust endured.
Paving the way for vice presidents like Bush and Gore was Walter Mondale, vice president to Jimmy Carter during his single term from 1977 to 1981. Under Carter's administration, the president and vice president became a working team. No longer was the vice president relegated to just attending funerals, as Harry Truman once lamented. Carter invited Mondale to every meeting that he scheduled and gave him the opportunity to pick and choose those he wished to attend. Carter and Mondale also held private luncheons each Monday to discuss any matters that either wanted to bring up. Mondale received the same daily intelligence information that Carter got and met regularly with the senior staff and the National Security Council, a tradition which continues to this day. Although Carter and Mondale lost their bid for re-election in 1980, and Mondale himself was no match for another former vice president, George H.W. Bush, in 1984, Walter Mondale's influence on the office and duties of the vice president are undeniable. Just as some vice presidents did much to advance the office of vice president, still others made their name through obstinance, and some might even argue dereliction of their vice presidential responsibilities. Looking at a few of the worst or least influential vice presidents, we begin with a look back to 1801, the start of Thomas Jefferson's term in office as president, and his vice president, Aaron Burr.
The rule of my life is to make business a pleasure, and pleasure my business.
Embittered by his loss to Jefferson, for which he blamed another political enemy, Alexander Hamilton, Burr was never trusted by the new president, and as such was shut out from the political processes of that office. Burr served dutifully as president of the Senate, however, and even his rivals credited his conduct, which fostered time-honored traditions that have held to this day in that office. At the same time, however, many of his fellow Republicans accused Burr of consorting with their opposition, the Federalists. Jefferson feared disloyalty as well, and in his bid for re-election in 1804, Jefferson dropped Burr from his ticket. After a failed attempt in running for governor of New York, Burr lashed out at Hamilton, who had once again opposed Burr in the election. Harsh letters were exchanged, with Burr accusing Hamilton of making disparaging remarks. On July 11, 1804, the two men dueled, as was Burr's request. Dueling was outlawed in New York, so the venue of Weehawken, New Jersey was chosen. Dueling was also illegal in New Jersey, but the punishment did not include the death penalty like it did in New York. Hamilton fought Burr with pistols, and Burr emerged victorious, killing Hamilton. Though Burr won the duel, his political career was effectively over, and Aaron Burr never held a political office again.
This is the criminal left that belongs not in a dormitory, but in a penitentiary. The criminal left is not a problem to be solved by the Department of Philosophy or the Department of English. It is a problem for the Department of Justice. Black or white, the criminal left is interested in power. It is not interested in promoting the renewal and reforms that make democracy work. It is interested in promoting those collisions and conflict that tear democracy apart.
Some in the Republican Party admired Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon's vice president, for his unabashed attacks on any political enemy of the Nixon White House. He frequently lashed out at the news media and anti-war demonstrators during the strife of the Vietnam conflict. Labeled Nixon's hatchet man, Agnew's duties included making speeches that defended the administration's actions during Vietnam and labeled any opposition un-American. Initially thought a strong choice for vice president, Nixon soon began to distrust Agnew, feeling the man lacked the vision and intelligence required, especially in matters of foreign policy. It is also theorized that Nixon, seeing Agnew becoming more popular among Americans, became jealous of the vice president's elevated status. Either way, Nixon began to shut Agnew out of most Oval Office business, and Agnew only conferred with the president at cabinet meetings and occasionally one-on-ones with the president, where the vice president was rarely permitted to discuss or offer advice on any matter of particular substance. In 1973, Agnew became only the second vice president to resign, after John Calhoun, and the only vice president to resign as a result of criminal charges. In the summer of that year, Agnew came under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland for allegedly receiving over $100,000 in bribes while in office as Baltimore County Executive, Governor of Maryland, and Vice President. Agnew was allowed to plead no contest to a charge of not reporting income in 1967 on the condition that he resigned from the vice presidency. He later paid the state of Maryland over $200,000 in penalties as a result of the bribery allegations. The fraud and dishonesty exposed in the Nixon administration was only beginning. The vice president's office had damaged his reputation and the voters' faith.
It is not just age, it's accomplishments, it's experience. I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
Few vice presidents, or indeed few elected officials, have been as defined by their gaffes as Dan Quayle. A member of the House of Representatives and later senator from Indiana, Quayle was often criticized for being an intellectual lightweight and a poor public speaker, often making erroneous or badly phrased statements. At a spelling bee in Trenton, New Jersey in 1992, Quayle famously corrected a student who had correctly spelled the word potato. Quayle insisted the student add an E to the end of the word. Quayle later stated that the materials provided by the school had been incorrect, and the vice president stuck to the cards rather than trusting his own judgment. Later, in response to the Los Angeles riots, Quayle famously remarked that the television program Murphy Brown was contributing to the country's alleged poverty of values. He claimed the violence and decay of morals were proliferated, amongst other reasons, for the depiction of a successful single mother on television. In 1996, Quayle decided against running for both governor of Indiana and seeking the Republican nomination for president due to health problems. In 2000, he did seek the nomination, and while he had more political experience than his fellow prospective candidates, the years he spent as a punchline in the vice president's office had damaged his reputation and the voters' faith. Today, the vice president is a partner to the president, rather than a mere figurehead. From the beginnings as a presidential runner-up, to the use of a running mate to broaden voter appeal, to the working team of leaders they have become today, the Vice President and President work together to shape policy and lead the nation of the United States of America. What does the future hold for the office of the Vice President? What new duties will arise, and what challenges will the Vice President face as the office evolves? And what men or women who hold that office will later go on to become President of the United States? Richard Nixon famously ended his campaign for governor with an ironic speech, considering he was later elected President of the United States.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference, and I hope that what I have said today will at least make television, radio, the press recognize that they have a right and a responsibility. If they're against a candidate, give him the shaft. But also recognize if they give him the shaft, put one lonely reporter on the campaign who will report what the candidate says now and then. Thank you, gentlemen, and good day.
Join us in our next episode as we take a look at the role of Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, played by the President, from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.